silence isn't quiet.
Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. How wonderful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. As always, it's good to be here. And apologies for my wife, Sasha. She's not with us. She had to rush back to Israel for an early birth of a grandson. And apologies for the bags under my eyes because I had to stay up last night until 3:30 so that I could be present on FaceTime for the circumcision. We're parents to 5 daughters. And I was actually quite relieved that we didn't have to go through the process of circumcision. Not so much because of the pain and the crying and the doubt that parents have as to inflicting wounds on their newborn child and what that might carry with it. I knew, as do most Jews, that unless you're going to say all Jewish men are really messed up, there's probably nothing wrong with infant circumcision. I was relieved for another reason. I was relieved because to take a child and bring them in to the covenant of Avraham, our father, which is the translation of the ceremony itself, a brit, or a bris, as perhaps you've heard, means covenant. It doesn't mean circumcision. It's something that is, it's not natural. To dictate to a child, you will be in this covenant. While it is natural to raise children according to a particular philosophy, theology, attitude towards life, to decide for them that kind of a thing is a difficult issue. I would have done it. I support our daughters, 2 of whom have had boys and have done this. But it's much easier in that way with girls. They can make up their own mind. Of course, they have to be born in order to make up their own minds. And the issue of birth and lack thereof is a common motif, as I'm sure you know, in the Torah, especially in the book of Genesis, but in fact all through the Hebrew scriptures. My good friend and teacher, Yair Zakovich at Hebrew University, always likes to say, if you want to be famous in the Bible, make sure your mother was barren at first. And Sarah is the first of many who will not give birth. In the male-dominated society of those days, and perhaps even in some places today, a woman who does not give birth is a failure. She's ill, she's sick, she's in need of healing. And so, by the way, is a man who has been circumcised at the age of 99. And that was the case with Abraham. He was 99 years old in the chapter before this when he was circumcised, and he circumcised his son Ishmael. I say his son, there would be a little star next to his son. And in a Jewish interpretation below in the footnote would say, not really. And that's the way our story tells the story. You may remember it was Sarah's idea to give her handmaiden Hagar to Avram to sleep with so a child would be born, and as soon as she became pregnant, Sarah was upset, and eventually the child and mother were kicked out of the household, came back, and left again, kicked out again. So it's safe to say that at least in the minds of those that wrote our Hebrew scriptures, Ishmael wasn't really the son. The son that was waited for was Yitzchak. Yitzchak meaning laughter. And hence the end of this story here. By the way, there's 4 different stories in Genesis alone that explain why his name Isaac was Yitzchak. Different people laughing at different times. This is only one of them that we read today. But what's the scene? The scene is Abraham is standing outside of his tent. Think Bedouin tents here. I don't know what it would be compared to. Those of us who were in the army, we know the tents that you roll up all the sides, especially in the desert, so the air can come through. Bedouin tent is like that. It can close to the side of the wind, but if there's no wind, you open up all sides in order to see who's coming by. Not in order to protect yourselves, because that's not the assumption, in order to bring in whoever is walking by. And this is Abraham, days after he's been under surgery, primitive surgery at age 99. He's out there looking for guests. That's the rabbinic tradition. The Torah itself, actually, this story begins with a line right before this, which is a meaningful line in the context of what I'd like to talk about today. And it is that God showed God's self to Abraham. And then it tells the story that 3 men were approaching. But the story begins with the title, God shows God's self to Abraham. As we read through the story in Hebrew, the 3 men, and in Hebrew all verbs are gendered, so you know it's a plural verb. They're all doing, speaking, sitting. Abraham addresses them until the point in which here in your English translation it says, then one of them asked, whereas Sarah, the Hebrew doesn't say, and one of them asked. The Hebrew says, and he asked. And from that point on, the men kind of disappear, and it's God. God's self speaking. In other words, the 3 men, who afterwards are understood as angels, are God's presence. And the Hebrew narrator playfully uses the grammar to slowly introduce that idea. What appeared to be 3 men is in essence God, God's self. Many of you, I'm sure, know of the early Christian interpretation that this in essence is the forerunner of the Trinity. The idea of the Trinity, appearing to God. And there's a wonderful idea in that God appears in very different ways, in different expressions. But the people, the angels, and by the way, the word angel in Hebrew does not mean one with wings or with a halo or things like that. That comes a little bit later. Those kind of angels actually appear at the very end of the Old Testament New Hebrew scripture period, which is the book of Daniel in the 2nd century BCE. Angels in other parts of the Hebrew scriptures are merely messengers. That's what the word means in Greek as well. Angelos is a messenger, not necessarily a heavenly being. So you've got God visiting Abraham right after he's had surgery and he's sick. You've got God visiting Sarah and asking for her when she, in that male-dominated society, is considered to be sick as well. God is there as the healer. In the Talmud, there's a question. In Deuteronomy it says, "You shall walk in the footsteps of the Lord your God." And one of the rabbis says, how can we possibly do that when we have a verse someplace else in the book of Daniel that says that God's pathways are filled with fire and brimstone? How could you possibly walk there? Says the rabbi, a little bit naively, or perhaps on purpose, pedagogically. Says, well, it doesn't mean to actually walk in God's way. It's to do as God does. And in the same way that God clothed the naked, because it says that Adam and Eve were naked and they saw themselves naked and God provided for them clothing, so too you shall provide. Follow God's footsteps. Follow God as a role model and provide clothes. And then it says, in the same way that God visited the sick, and this is the case that it gives, and it goes on also to say in the same way that God buried Moses, buried the dead, because it was only God and Moses up on the mountain when he died and he was buried, so you shall too imitate God. The ideal of imitating the deity, which is so central to all faith traditions. Imitating the deity, to be better people. So we have a lovely lesson in Genesis here in how to act as society. Not just God, but Abraham and Sarah as well. Abraham being so hospitable and Sarah being so nervous and so anxious. And there's a wonderful lesson there as well. Really? I'm in my 80s and I'm going to give birth? Really? He's going to get it up at that age? Are you serious? There's humor. Of course, it's tragic because Isaac in his life did not have humor. Would you have humor if you looked up and saw your father with a knife about to kill you on the altar? Would you have humor if you lost your mother, who was your only protector, and were not comforted until someone else found a wife for you, as Abraham's servant did when he came back with Rebekah? Still, laughter is in the background. One approach to leadership, aside from the laughter, is to be with the tent open. To look in all directions. To welcome wherever people are coming. Today's society, we can't really do that. We need to have one door in which there's an entrance controlled, we understand. But still, to create a service, as Rev Kev has done, as I'm trying to do, and many of us here in the Palm Springs area, a service which is welcoming to people of all faiths and all different kinds of human expression. Those are the tent flaps that are open in the four directions. But you know, and many of you may even hear it amongst yourselves, certainly in many synagogues and I imagine churches around the world, in Europe in particular, in the United States, Europe where attendance in synagogues is not really been very significant since World War II, but certainly in recent times, and here in North America, where people don't come. And you've got churchgoers and synagogues saying, well, we want them to come, we welcome them, but why aren't they coming? Well, the answer to that comes, I think, in the scripture from the Gospels. You've got to go out and say hello to them. You've got to go out and reach out to them. You've got to be a missionary community. You never thought you'd hear a rabbi say that in church. But you do have to go out. It's kind of like when you're in community, you're holding hands in a circle, and you're doing the things and you're looking to each other. You're letting each other be yourselves. You're recognizing the godly image in each other human being. You look to your left, you look to your right as well, as the Muslims do in their tradition prayer, before they say Salam Alaikum to both sides. But at some point, everybody has to let go of their hands and turn around and face outward. And that's what Jesus is calling his disciples to do. You may know that in the section before the little paragraph that we read are stories after stories of Jesus the healer, walking in the footsteps, as I can say, walking in God's footsteps as someone visiting the sick and healing them. And the section afterwards goes into the list of the apostles who are to go out and their names. Both of these readings give us a template for how to build community and how to improve society. We need to be aware of who's walking around outside and to bring them in to our homes. But at some point we've got to go out and greet them where they are and meet them where they are, and not just geographically where they are, but spiritually, ideologically where they are. And that's a difficult thing. It's difficult because sometimes the people who need our help the most are very, very challenging to us from an aesthetic point of view, from an attitude point of view, people who suffer from a drug addiction and from mental illness. That makes it difficult. And others who we want to reach out to have political and social ideas so far from our own, there's a gap there as well. And yet that's what we're being commanded to do. As a Jew, as a rabbi, I'd like to say that we do enough of the first, we need to do more of the second. So may the scripture today, from both of our traditions, enrich us all on this day in which we give thanks for fathers. A difficult thing, not because my children are not around, but because I know how many people are not fathers. Perhaps did not want to be, perhaps wanted to be, but did not have that privilege. It's a difficult thing also because it drives a dichotomy between fathers and mothers, two separate days. You know that I've lived most of my life in Israel, and I have a lot of criticism towards the state of Israel and Israeli society. It still is my home, where 4 of our daughters live, 2 of my grandchildren, and we may end up there after we finish our working careers. But if there is one thing I'd like to point out today, which is a great gift that Israel has given the world, is that there's no longer Yom Ha'em, Mother's Day, celebrated in Israel. There really never was Yom Ha'av. There was never a Father's Day. But Mother's Day was celebrated since, the beginning of the State of Israel. Already in 1947, the year before the state was established, an organization that was to help women give birth and nursing, whatever you call it, the baby station. They created this holiday. And but in the 90s, in view of gender equality, people began to ask for a different holiday on that same day. And it's called Yom HaMishpacha. It's Family Day. I'd like to suggest that might be a better way of us here in America celebrating as well, because everybody has a family. Not everyone has a father, not everyone has a mother, not everyone is a father or mother, but everybody has some sort of family, either biological or otherwise. And finally, on this day that we mark Juneteenth, something very, very new to me, something actually I hadn't even heard of before I moved back here to the United States. The point of what we do, whether it's healing or whether it's outreach with our message, as Abraham and Sarah did, the point of what we do is to teach the oneness of God, the oneness that includes each and every human being, and yea, the entire earth. And that oneness demands of us as human beings, which was demanded centuries ago, that no other human being be enslaved by another. It's amazing that it took us so long to get that here in the United States and in other places. But we're aware that it's still not the norm all over the world. If we follow in Abraham and Sarah's footsteps, if we follow in Jesus and the apostles' footsteps, then we are to teach and to internalize that each and every human being is created in God's image and therefore all equal.